Politics is taking an interesting turn. We do not rape women in the UK leaflet, recently published by the government, signals something almost elemental. For a start, it reveals a deep naivety in do-gooder politicians who know what's good for us. I think it comes from the way they've observed many new arrivals being prosecuted for of rape and such like that they've committed, when they put up the defence of, oh, we didn't know it was not allowed in your country. And the naive, inexperienced or ideologically inculcated politicians interpret that as evidence. Oh, if only they knew, then they would use normal human reason, like us, dreadfully educated and urbane and cultural people in the United Kingdom, legacy people, not the new arrivals, of course, and they will change their ways because they have a leaflet to tell them that we don't do that sort of thing here. This is naivety on an Olympian scale. Except the difference is that the scale is gigantic, but even the gods in Olympus would not be so elementally stupid. It is quite shocking. The second part of this mistake is that because it's been published, it's drawn to the attention of a huge chunk of the English, United Kingdom, I should say, Scots and Welsh and Northern Irish middle class. What's really going on, which is artificial stupidity on a vast scale. One of the side effects of ideological inculcation is denial of the importance of experience. Experience gives you a way of being able to see things coming before they happen in many cases. The police, for instance, has suffered dreadfully from this over the years. In the old days, if a policeman was in a pub or a bar or whatever, and things were about to kick off, as they say, they could sense it coming and take proactive steps to stop the worst from happening. In other words, if they saw someone squaring up to someone else, they were moving quickly and restrained them, if need be, with some ferocity before the first potentially very dangerous punches are thrown. Glasses smashed and all that sort of thing could follow quite quickly. Instead, they are taught now to stay, don't act. Body cam footage is all, of course, until they have absolute good reason to act. By that time, most likely, the person who's the victim of the aggressor may be on the floor, a face covered with blood and a bottle halfway through their cheek. Jagged bits of glass all over the place, screaming and bellowing, chaos in a pub, spilt beer, fear, anger, chaos, all because they're no longer allowed to use intuitive judgment and perception to head that off before it happens. Now you may say, oh, that's dreadfully unjust. They should stand as passive observers until things happen. But you see, what happens is that by doing that, they're not only doing the victims of this aggression and unkindness a great disservice, and society, by letting violence increase, but they're also doing a disservice to the perpetrator. Far better to be arrested for maybe some actions liable to cause a breach of the peace than to be sent down for GBH. So there is a sort of injustice and inhumanity in this. It's coupled with a sort of control freak fixation but everything has to be done by the book. This is very ideological, and that trusting people to use their judgment is now out of order. This comes from the way the law is administered and actually acts in the justice system, as well as from over-prescriptive legislation with particular aspects of it that enable whole chunks of laws to be, as it were, put on the shelf and ignored on the basis that they are unlawful. The difference between breaking the law and doing something unlawfully is that when you break a law, there's a specific law that says if you do this, you're a naughty boy or girl and need to be convicted and punished accordingly or held to account. But unlawful is where it might be judged that either there isn't a law and there should be a law to convict someone, or alternatively, someone might be obeying a law, but because that particular action is in breach of a human right, the human right is allowed to negate that legislation. It's quite different. In the UK, in Britain, particularly England, I don't know about Scotland, because Scottish law is a different thing. The principle was fundamentally before a principle of negative law, and that is that if there isn't a law forbidding you to do it, assume you can. Positive law works the other way around. In positive law, everything is forbidden unless a law says that you have a right to do this, that and the other. So theoretically, under positive law, if there isn't a sign on the grass saying do not walk on the grass, if you're in a nice sort of university area, assume you can't walk on the grass unless it says walking on the grass is permitted. This is a bit weird, I know, that's an extreme example, but in general, under positive law, that is what applies. So what happens then is you have a whole litany of rights, of this, that and the other, which are prescriptive and written down. And what's important is these rights are not democratically produced. They come out of the imaginations of lawyers, judges, politicians. Oh, that'd be nice to have that. Let's have that as a right, you know. And these rights come and go in as far as that they're either legally or struck down, or more often they're just not enforced by the will of the politicians. So it's rather clever because it means that the politicians have the right to, on a whim almost, to curtail your freedom or to permit you to do things without any action on the part of the legislation or even the normal processes of the justice system. So what we have here with the business of this little leaflet is that the idea is that, well, these poor little, immigrants, they were innocent. They weren't told that rape and child abuse and all this stuff is illegal. So they were effectively innocent. There's no thought of the old system we had, which is ignorance of the law is no excuse. Oh, no. So this is dreadfully patronising when you think about it, and dehumanising. But then you see, if you're an ideologue, they treat people as not as human beings, but as creatures to be forced into conformity so they fit into a perfect, so-called perfect political and social system, which is consistent with their utopian ambitions. And this utopia, which they call, though they don't say it, but they do, heaven on earth, of course is going to be run by guess who? Them. And they will have the power. And everyone else will be forced to be happy, forced to conform, And what a lovely world that will be. Now, the ideologues, in this case in this country, mainly left-wing, because the right-wing ideology was rightly smashed after the Second World War by the Allies. One particular example, in 1945-46, the greatest book burning, in effect, was in fact book pulping, was carried out by the Allied forces to denazify Germany, part of the project. Great thing to do. But the same was not done to left-wing or socialist ideology, which was carefully curated by the Soviet Union and particularly by Stalin. And it's a mistake people have, is that the Second World War was triggered by an ideological conflict between two gangs, led by two gang leaders, which is of course A.H., I'm not using his proper name because it gives people the creeps, and Uncle Joe, cuddly little Uncle Joe, a sort of a propaganda name after we sort of suddenly became very keen on Russia after A.H. decided he'd have a pop at them. It was a critical and absolutely desperate mistake, obviously on the part for the Germans. And my God, they paid for it after the Second World War. The rape statistics that Germany suffered at the end of the war were just phenomenal, which is interesting because the troops were told, obviously, that maybe, had a little bit of fun. Now, understandable in a way, but it's not forgivable. If you've been through the utter dehumanised experience of war, bloody hell that it was, and, tens of millions of your population have been slaughtered, civilian and military, and at last you get into the country that was infested by the ideology that caused that. The winning gang is going to behave in an obscene and nasty way, and it did. It's just like in the Middle Ages. It was quite common to let rip, cry riot when a city was taken, and a certain period was allowed for looting, pillaging, and all sorts of savage inhumanity towards civilians to reward the troops. Bloodlust, theft, death. What fun! So we are dealing with something very primitive here. And one of the illusions we have nowadays is that this primitive potential, I was going to say instinct, I don't believe it's instinctive necessarily, but its potential for gross inhumanity and horror is still with us. It never went away. It's been held in check because technology has bought it off. The population generally today in the United Kingdom, but not so in that places where many of the new arrivals come from, the population has, in the words of Macmillan, never had it so good. Now, I'm not excusing the extremes of poverty, deprivation, unfairness, caste distinction, class distinction, all that sort of stuff, not at all. But if you look back to the 19th century in the United Kingdom, the largest employment was for the class, for people in service. And many of them were women, the majority were women. And they may have worked 40 years in a house. Their whole life was a house, social life, everything else. And they weren't allowed to marry. If they married, they had to leave. And when they retired, they went to a world, if they didn't have children or family, where there was nothing for them. Utter poverty. A sort of social obscenity for 40 years loyal service, and maybe in the end their knees can't work it anymore and they can't go up staircases anymore. Get the coal, move that around, all that sort of thing. Nothing there. Now I remember, as a child, I was brought up with flashes of immense privilege. They had a big house not far from where I live here. It's now National Trust. And they had servants who came down from Manchester. The family had cotton money. They were cotton kings. And one was called Eva, another one Louis. I think Rini was locally, but I think Eva and Louis, particularly Eva, came down with the family from Manchester. They brought the servants down. And when I think it was Brown in the Wilson government introduced a tax, it was called SET, Selective Employment Tax. And the idea was, well, these toffs, they shouldn't have servants. I mean, that's a thing of the past. That was true. A sort of a liveried servant, yes, my lord, no, my lord, 3 bags full, my lord. But remember, at the peak of service, sometimes that was the only thing available and the best possible choice for millions of people in a brutally Darwinian social world of Victorian Edwardian years, before anything like pensions, that sort of stuff. And when SET came in, the in-house staff were sacked. And instead, in this big house, they had people called dailies who came in and worked in effect on a day-by-day contract basis. And they weren't subject to SET. My grandmother, long dead, she died in 78 at 100, went down to see Eva. It was rather a sad business in the late 60s, I think, because she knew it was a miserable business. Miserable. I don't know much detail, but I remember as a small child, I was sitting in a place called the Marble Hall, very grand place, and it was at Christmas. I think it was 62, might be 61. Anyway, we were visiting, and I sat on a sofa, and I think it was Eva and Louis who sat either side of me. I was a tiny little child then, I can't have been more than 6, something like that. And they held my hands. Now, this sounds rather pathetic, but it was one of the most important moments of my life. And with hindsight, it gave me a certain sort of contact and appreciation of the humanity and the sadness of our lot as I grew older. I didn't often have people hold my hand then. In fact, I can hardly remember anyone else doing that. Later, when I drove lorries in Manchester, after I left the family, that was reinforced. It's very fine having theoretical, ideological theories about people, as these ideologues have, the ones that pushed out that leaflet saying, oh, it's naughty to rape people. They're out of their tiny skulls. You're dealing with something vastly more elemental. You're dealing with a genuine clash of cultures, and a very serious one. There are people coming from the world which is more brutal, or as brutal, possibly more, than Victorian London, into a world of, would say, the sea is flowing with milk and honey. Can you blame them? No, of course not. Just in the same way as could you blame teenage girls from very poor families entering service in the 19th century and Edwardian days and being forbidden to marry? The trade-off is that they had, 3 good meals a day, they had a roof over their head, and they had security. Of course, the downside is they were in a social prison with no benefits or help once they became no longer able to perform their duties. They sort of bought off penury and sold their souls because they had no other choice. Can you imagine having any political opinion which was sort of slightly radical or lefty, whatever you want to call it, and then the owner of the house or the lady of the house, or whoever it was, finding out that you were harbouring such crazy ideas, can you imagine you keep your job? Yeah, it sounds awful, but that's the way it was. In the same way, so they did that. In the same way, these young men coming across here, you know, I fully understand what's going on. And they, now, as opposed to the ones in the 70s, the immigrants coming here in the 70s, 60s and 70s, who generally wanted to participate in a society because they saw it as better in many ways than the ones they left. This new arrival, the last couple of million, mainly young men, can you think of the stupidity of letting it happen? Look upon us as utter and complete fools. And if you look at the intellectual class in this country, they look down their nose at those they feel are less intelligent or less educated than they are. The contempt is almost palpable. You can see it on Twitter and elsewhere. It just oozes. Now, they had the same capacity for contempt as these young men coming across on the boats. Is it no surprise that there's a sort of unholy alliance of contempt for legacy culture and society between the, as you might call, bien-pensants, the know-all ideological, currently woke, obsessed caste in control, largely control of the levers of government, and the new arrivals. I know it's a cliche, but birds of a feather flock together. This is why that leaflet is so interesting. On another point of the leaflet, it is a political disastrous move, because it will open, and it's opening the eyes of some of the bien-pensants who haven't really realised the implications of what they've been encouraging and supporting. It's very strange. The ugly business of this all, and I admit it, is that when you have colliding cultures, you can't just publish a leaflet and solve a problem like that. There are two ways out, really, or maybe three. One way is to make certain the justice system comes down on those who rape and abuse and so on with great ferocity. The second way is to make it very plain to people who haven't yet put foot on this ground that they need to turn around and go away. Now, the trouble with this approach is that you need little people at quite a junior level, I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, to enforce this. So some person on maybe little more minimum wage could, given the circumstances, have the power of almost of life and death over someone who's trying to get into the country illegally. Once you do that, the political implications are massive, because you're inviting the development of a political system which is would be reminiscent of the early days of blind authoritarian government. And the problem with blind authoritarianism is it's rather like with Sen's ideological state, they're really the same, is that it's the comparison is that it's like a blind machine gunner in terror, firing a gun in every direction, trying to use their ears to see where the enemy are. It's a disaster. And in that situation, in the heat of a war, the best way is to lob a hand grenade at them. Yeah, it's we're in dangerous times. Very dangerous times. So taking out leaflet and looking at the implications, first of all, what it says about the people who thought it's a good idea to publish it. What are the implications about its view of government attitude towards new arrivals? Is it going to do any good? What does it say about collision of cultures? It's a disaster. Politically, it's a disaster. But it does seem to admit that so far most on the ideological left have been unwilling to admit that there is a rape and abuse scandal connected with the behaviour of some new arrivals. In the 1990s, we used to live in the East End, and we took in many lodgers from Palestine, from Ghana, from all sorts of places, if you include Ireland with some Irish too, a few English, Scots, and Lebanese, Syrian, Libyan. All of these were successful. The Palestinians were pretty angry, understandably, because they used to talk about being forced to live in a large prison. And that's true. You look at the Middle East and the attempts to be logical about solving a problem are completely hopeless. It's beyond that. Because this is a war based on raw emotion. One side's had been dispossessed and driven out of their homeland over the last century. There's no doubt about that. And forced to live in a sort of almost like a zoo. And the other side suffered in living memory, has suffered just in living memory, suffered the effect of mechanised systemic mass murder, and desperate to have somewhere they can call their own. So these two are, as it were, unstoppable forces going at each other. A sophisticated approach would understand that reason is not the only way of negotiating. You can use emotion. This may sound stupid, but knowledge, all sound knowledge, requires not only a factual appreciation of what it's saying, but an emotional dimension. So all these people getting together with grand plans to sort of make a sort of logical paradise for the Palestinians, it's doomed to fail. Not going to start. Because we're dealing with something much more elemental. It's not irrational, it's non-rational. And you have to think in emotional terms. Because otherwise you're going to get nowhere. And these negotiators aren't doing it with that angle. They're not doing it at all. They're thinking as if grand politicians from the days of the imperial domination of the Middle East, moving people and countries around like dominoes. Oh dear, there's a few who take up on us, throw them off the board, and put them, and carving up Syria and other areas, making nice little imperial boundaries. They've still got it in their heads. Raw emotional appreciation is so much more important. And indeed you can. I'll give you a small example of how this works, because I learned the hard way. I may have said this before in a blog some time ago, but it's worth repeating. Years back we had a difficulty with a neighbour. Now, I'm not saying the right's wrong who started it, but it was getting to a point where letters were being put through our letterbox. And not rude ones, but certainly passive aggressive, no doubt about that. So it was brewing, And when you get that sort of thing, it can get a little bit upsetting. Anyway, after about a few months of this, I thought we've got to do something about this. So it was a female neighbour, but it could have been a male. It doesn't matter. Often the men are a lot more dangerous, actually. So intuitively, I thought, okay, reason is broken down. I don't want to get anywhere doing that. So I went down to a shop a few miles away and bought quite an expensive small box of chocolates. Not something I would normally do. I'm a bit mean, but there you go. And put it through her letterbox. Did the trick. We started being able to be reasonable with each other again, because that act was really saying, look, we're human. So we really, both of us, need a solution. I'm willing to go the extra mile and show a bit of respect. Small thing. And it worked. A lot of disputes are caused by people who feel that you're not showing emotional respect for their humanity, for who they are. You're treating them rather like a sort of thing, like you would a lot of people treat animals on the farm, cattle prod, Well, no wonder they get angry. No wonder reason collapses. Well, in the Middle East, my God, they've got a reason for that. Both sides of that conflict. They've got a reason in letters 10,000 feet high. And both those emotional reasons are very, very valid, whatever people say. So the disastrous conflict is on a basis of reason. There's no solution. So if you're going to just go on trying to reason you out of it, you're wasting your time. You have to find some other dimension, some other device, some other method of getting to the point where you can use reason. But unless that happens, then all it becomes is just a ghastly holding situation, and injustice becomes baked into the whole thing. And yeah, injustice on both sides. I mean, the incursion into what is now Israel a couple of years ago, with all the sort of horrors, pretty nasty. And then the continuing imprisonment of Palestinians and military occupation and bombs and God knows what else. Yeah, that's pretty nasty too. It is possible, if you allow for an emotional way of dealing, at first emotional stage, to transform the situation. It is possible in the intersubjective, which is for two wrongs to make a right. But in the world of pure reason, where logic is supreme, that is impossible. So that leaflet, that government leaflet, is, I think, what we've seen later on, the turning point. They may try and row back on it, just like the people who, the Guardian newspaper and various other left-leaning media newspapers are now busily trying to row back on their criticisms of our day after his suicide. But I think the die is cast. So what the opponents to ideology need to do, I'm not talking about right wing, the opponents of ideology, because the right wing, if it were to become fully ideological again, would be just as ghastly as the left wing, possibly worse, just as ghastly, is to formulate an alternative to ideological politics. And that's one of the main reasons why I do these podcasts, and I've written a lot on things. The book Corporate Power, all unpublished. Unified Theory of Humanity, unpublished, doesn't matter. And Contradiction. There are 3 attempts to start providing a more coherent, a more thoughtful, and a far better founded basis to understanding society. The left-wing approach is ideological currently, and that is that they have their ideology and believe that society should be destroyed and replaced by ideology. And an authoritarian group of leaders, suitably dressed up with red rosettes, to ensure that we get to that heaven on earth, and that nothing should stop them in their noble and valiant, selfless struggle. If people get in the way, then they have to be crushed, either metaphorically or literally. So that is, you might call it passive-aggressive in these people. No, it isn't. If you take away and look at them carefully, underneath, aggressive and dangerous. All ideologues are this way inclined, so I'm not being particularly rude about the left wing. Left and right wing are just shades of authoritarianism. The so-called centrists are just as authoritarian at heart, but their methodology is willing to allow for years, maybe even decades before any great move happens. They major on manipulation, deceit, and enticement. They think they do it that way without necessarily locking people up or being vile to them in other ways, or even murdering them, as in the case of Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. They don't want to do that. They're too genteel and nice. But underneath, they're as absolute in their objective as any Trotskyist or Bolshevik or any modern version of those, or on the other side, Nazi, fascist, or theocrat. The theocrats are appallingly dangerous, but we seem to think it's rather clever to have them in this country now. Theocracy is the ambition of some of the more extreme versions of Islam. In the same way, you had extreme versions of Christianity that were pointing in a similar way. But Christianity isn't so overtly imperialistic in its structure, even though it's capable of motivating imperialism almost as thoroughly as certain ideologically takes on Islam. And I'm certainly not denying, saying that Islam is any worse or better than Christianity. A Prince Charles approach, ho ho. I'm a defender of faiths. I just don't believe in any of the religions. But I think it is possible for a society to accommodate them, as long as they don't attempt to destroy society or usurp it, in the same way that ideology tries to destroy and usurp society. That's the real danger. A religion that is happy with a society isn't a problem. A religion, whatever it is, that wants to destroy society and become society, then that becomes a problem. And that's one of the reasons why a certain interpretation of growing religion in this country is so closely allied to left-wing ideology. Because they both see society as something to be eliminated and to be replaced for something which they feel is far more logical, pure, good, well-intentioned, humane, and just. I don't subscribe to that. I think society is elemental to humanity, and we cannot survive without it. It's not a matter of either or. It's a matter of fact. Society's been around as long, if not longer, than humanity. The difference now is we can talk about it because we have the words to speak of things which would, strictly speaking, be unimaginable. We can talk about abstractions, about culture, about society, about justice, about law, about love, about emotions we can talk about. But before language we couldn't do that. So essentially our intellectual landscape inside our heads was desperately restricted. We can also talk about force, about gravity. These words are absolutely essential. Yet you ask me to describe gravity, well, I can sort of say it makes things drop or something, or, a large object has more gravitational pull than a small one, they attract each other, blah, blah, blah. But that's demonstrative. I can't describe it. And then again, there's two critical words which language enables us to use. We may understand, but we can't imagine it. One is movement, or change, same sort of thing. And the other, I've lost the words actually, I forgot what the other one is. Oh yes, contradiction. Now, strictly speaking, that's unimaginable. But it is the word which we give meaning to unlock logic. Because logic is a closed system, and when you're in a closed system, there's no way of getting out of it. It justifies itself. It's circular. It's what they call tautology. It gets nowhere. Oh, he would never commit that crime because he's not like that. That's a secular argument. It says nothing. It just assumes and states. It's axiomatic. And any political theory that's axiomatic essentially says nothing. Except it might say something about the prejudices or malign ambition of the person who's mouthing it, or possibly misplaced good intentions. But no more than that. The only political system that's any good is an open system. And the only open system in politics is democracy. All the others are axiomatic, theocratic, religious, what do you want to call them, Nazi, fascist, socialist, communist, Trotskyist, Bolshevik, whatever. They're all closed systems. So when Orwell expressed this in the words of O'Brien, a few paragraphs toward the end of 1984, after O'Brien said the Nazis and the communists were the same, but they didn't really realise it. But they were. They were fixated on power for its own sake. When Orwell said, in his words, O'Brien's words, the torturer's words, power is power, that was circularity. And circularity is a curse. We've had it. This particular mentality was the fatal flaw of the philosophical enlightenment. All the technology and stuff flowered. The reason why Newton's calculus did so well, is because it was quite useful in designing military equipment. You could calculate how far a projectile would go and what sort of amount of explosive power you would need, and the design of the gun and so on and so forth. They're useful stuff. You could, in effect, do a mental experiment on paper using calculus and other intellectual devices to design things that never existed, and then go and build them. You can work out, if you're building a bridge, how much metal you need so it doesn't fall down. So you don't waste huge amounts of metal over-engineering it. But it doesn't fall down because you can predict stresses and strains of physics and calculus and all that stuff. You can predict how material will behave because you understand physics formula, and the way things in the physical reality behave. It's a fantastic tool to enable the imagination to become reality and to form imagination in the process. Incredibly creative, manufacturing things. Of course, again, going back to bien paysan, the idea of grubby industrialists being productive and imaginative, beyond their ken. They call marketing and advertising one of some of the creative industries. They're not industries, but in calling themselves industries, they don't realise that in fact they're putting a finger on something very true, and that is that the process of making, shall we say, a pocket calculator from raw materials is fantastically creative and metamorphic in the way these things combine together, so that the sum of utilities and natures of its parts is nothing like the product. The same with the mental freedom when ideas combine. The resultant idea is not the sum of the ideas that formed it, although it is the product. So sum and product are different. Now in mathematics, they're a bit sloppy about that for obvious reasons. The world's interesting. The right wing, so-called, but I like to think that most of them are just not ideologues at the time being, because right ideologies smashed by the Second World War, good thing too, need to abandon the left-right authoritarian metaphor and need to try and establish a common, certainly a better theory of society than what the left's pumping out, because the left's theory of society is to destroy it. That's what it comes down to, and replace it with ideology. What we need is a more coherent and strong intellectual base to combat that with ferocity. So there's no hiding place for ideologues, and they can feel the full weight of opposition. If need be, and I don't like saying this because I hate this word, if they step out of line too far, full contempt, the sort of attitude they dished out and still dish out to those who dare question ideology or the pursuit of power for its own sake. Because that's what they're all about. No holds barred, as far as the left is concerned, when they come across someone who disagrees with them. I had someone recently, in my last podcast, when I was feeling unwell, because I'm just at the tail end of cancer. It's almost gone now, so don't worry about it. I had a little sort of unpleasant experience. And I had a dressing gown on. They call it the bathrobe. Shows they must be American, I suppose, I don't know. And their reply to my last one, which was about sociology and the importance and the flaws and misunderstanding and so on and so forth. And it boiled down to this literally. I was wearing a bathrobe. And then they said, "You're a liar, liar, liar." And that was the sum total of their criticism. They had a few more lies flung in, and one or two innuendos and so on and so forth. And there's a sort of desperate mental fear they have. And they think any opposition dehumanises them, because their thoughts are controlled by inhuman ideology. But the truth remains, I think, hence I am. So if I say anything that opposes that or questions it, I am, as it were, holding a knife to their throat. That's how they feel. Very frightened, angry, and emotionally distraught, sort of incontinence. They can't really reason. And as you know, if you abandon reason in a world of change, then you're in trouble. And what they do instead is, because by the first paradox of reason, emotion has to drive reason, otherwise there's no reason to reason. The sort of reason bit of that disappears and the emotion remains there. So they try and use an emotional argument, which paradoxically is in a way understandable. In the same way that I was talking about the Israel and the Gaza situation. Well, it's an interesting place. And that leaflet, you ought to seek it out. because it is rather special. Anyway, bye for now.